The morning sun was just beginning to peek over the Montana mountains when Harold Thompson stepped onto his front porch. At 93 years old, he moved a bit slower these days, but his eyes were still sharp and clear as the morning sky. His wrinkled hands gripped a steaming cup of coffee, black, just as he drunk it during his army days more than 70 years ago. Harold's small house sat peacefully along Route 12, a quiet stretch of road that wound through the countryside like a lazy river. The white paint was a little faded, and the green shutters needed some touching up, but to Harold, it was paradise. He had lived here alone since his beloved wife, Martha, passed away 5 years ago, finding comfort in his daily routines and the memories they had built together. In his backyard, rows of vegetables grew in neat lines. Tomatoes, carrots, and green beans that Harold tended to every morning. Gardening kept his hands busy and his mind sharp. Sometimes, neighborhood children would stop by, fascinated by the old man who could make things grow so well. Harold always sent them home with paper bags full of fresh vegetables, enjoying their excited smiles and endless questions about his garden. But Harold's true pride and joy sat in his garage, a 1942 Harley-Davidson WLA motorcycle, lovingly restored to its original military glory. The bike had been his constant companion since 1945, when he'd managed to buy one just like the one he rode during the war. Every piece of chrome sparkled, and the olive-drab paint looked as fresh as it had in the 1940s. The white star on the fuel tank stood out crisp and clean, just like it had when Harold served with the 101st Airborne Division. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Harold would put on his old leather jacket, carefully swing his leg over the motorcycle's seat, and ride the 3 miles to Jenny's diner. The regulars there knew him well. "Here comes the colonel," they would say, though Harold would always smile and remind them he had only made it to sergeant. Jenny, the owner's daughter, always had his usual breakfast ready: 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and a side of crispy bacon. "Tell us about the war, Harold," the younger customers would often ask, especially when they saw him arrive on his military motorcycle. Harold would share simple stories about friendship and courage, about the importance of standing up for what's right. He never talked about the tough parts, the ones that still sometimes woke him up at night. Instead, he focused on tales that made people smile and think. Most afternoons, Harold could be found in his garage, working on his motorcycle. He had a special routine: check the oil, polish the chrome, adjust the cables, and make sure everything ran perfectly. The garage walls told their own story, covered with old photographs from his service days. There he was, standing proud in his uniform, surrounded by his brothers in arms. Another showed him on a similar motorcycle in France, carrying messages between Allied positions. Each picture held a memory, a piece of history that Harold kept alive through his stories and his restored bike. The local kids were fascinated by his garage. To them, it was like a museum. Harold taught them about motorcycle maintenance, showing them how to use tools properly and the importance of taking care of things. "If you treat something with respect," he would say, "it'll last a lifetime." He spoke from experience. His motorcycle was living proof of that wisdom. As evening approached each day, Harold would sit in his porch swing, watching the sunset paint the sky in beautiful colors. The soft purr of passing cars and the chirping of birds created a peaceful melody. Sometimes, other veterans from town would stop by, sharing coffee and quiet conversations. They understood each other without needing many words. Life had settled into a comfortable pattern for Harold. Each day brought its own small joys: the satisfaction of tending his garden, the pleasure of riding his beloved motorcycle, the smiles of people at the diner, and the peace of his evening routine. He had earned this quiet life, though he would never say so himself. The respect he received from his neighbors and friends came naturally, built over years of being the kind, steady presence they could always count on. Little did Harold know that his peaceful world was about to face a challenge that would test his courage once again, though in a very different way than the war had. But for now, he enjoyed another beautiful Montana morning, sipping his coffee and planning which vegetables needed attention in his garden today. The American flag on his porch fluttered gently in the breeze, a quiet reminder of the freedom he had helped protect so many years ago. The trouble started on a warm Tuesday afternoon in June. Harold was working in his garden when he first heard them, the loud roar of multiple motorcycles, much louder than any that usually passed by his house. The noise was so intense that it made his windows rattle. As he straightened up from his tomato plants, leaning on his wooden cane, he saw them for the first time: the Steel Wolves Motorcycle Club. There were about 15 of them, riding expensive new motorcycles painted in black and chrome. Their leather vests displayed a snarling wolf's head surrounded by flames. Leading the pack was a tall man with a thick beard and dark sunglasses, who people in town would soon come to know as Razor. At first, Harold didn't think much of it. Motorcycle groups often passed through town during the summer months. But this was different. The Steel Wolves began making Route 12 their regular path, and they seemed to take special pleasure in causing disruption as they passed Harold's house. Every afternoon around 3 o'clock, the roar would begin. The bikers would slow down near his property, revving their engines until the noise was almost painful. Some would yell out comments or laugh as they passed. Harold's cat, Old Sergeant, started hiding under the bed whenever he heard them coming. One morning, Harold went out to collect his mail and found his mailbox knocked over, tire tracks in his grass showing it was no accident. He spent an hour in the hot sun, digging a deeper hole and cementing the post to make it stronger. The next day, he found it knocked over again. Jenny from the diner noticed something was wrong when Harold missed his regular Thursday breakfast for the first time in years. She drove out to check on him and found him picking up scattered pieces of mail from his yard. The Steel Wolves had struck again, this time leaving black tire marks across his freshly mowed lawn. "You should call the police, Harold," Jenny suggested, helping him gather his letters. Harold just shook his head. "Sheriff Miller has enough to worry about," he said quietly. "Besides, they're just trying to get attention." But things got worse. The Steel Wolves began parking their bikes at the edge of Harold's property, leaving cigarette butts and empty beer cans on his grass. They would point and laugh at his vintage military motorcycle whenever he rode it into town. Razor, their leader, seemed to take particular interest in bothering Harold. He was younger than most of his gang, probably in his mid-30s, with a long scar on his left cheek that gave him his nickname. One day, he followed Harold all the way to Jenny's diner, riding close behind him and mockingly imitating the old man's careful driving style. "Look at Grandpa on his antique," Razor called out to his friends, who were waiting in the diner's parking lot. "Better not go too fast, old-timer. Wouldn't want you breaking a hip." The other customers in the diner watched through the windows, angry but unsure what to do. Harold kept his dignity, parking his motorcycle and walking inside without acknowledging the taunts. But Jenny could see his hands shaking slightly as he tried to hold his coffee cup. The local sheriff, Tom Miller, did try to help. He started parking his patrol car near Harold's house and gave warnings to the bikers about noise violations. But he couldn't be there all the time, and the Steel Wolves seemed to know exactly when he was off duty. The other elderly veterans in town started avoiding their regular visits to Harold's house, afraid of running into the bikers. Harold found himself spending more time inside, watching through his windows as the gang turned his quiet street into their personal playground. Even the neighborhood children stopped coming by for vegetables. Their parents worried it wasn't safe anymore when the bikers were around. Harold's garden started to show signs of neglect as he became more hesitant to work outside. The final straw came when Harold walked into his garage one morning and found the door had been forced open during the night. His beloved military motorcycle had been knocked over. Someone had scratched old-timing ER across the fuel tank and painted a crude wolf's head over the Army star. As Harold stood there in his garage, looking at his damaged motorcycle, something changed in his eyes. The hand holding his cane tightened until his knuckles turned white. In that moment, he wasn't just a 93-year-old man anymore. He was once again Sergeant Harold Thompson of the 101st Airborne Division, and he had faced far worse enemies than a group of bullies on motorcycles. The time had come to make a stand, but not in the way anyone, especially the Steel Wolves, would expect. Harold spent hours in his garage that evening, carefully cleaning his vandalized motorcycle. His hands moved slowly over the scratches in the paint, each one feeling like a personal insult. The garage light cast long shadows as he worked, and for the first time in years, he left his radio turned off. He needed to think. Sheriff Miller had come by earlier after Harold called about the break-in. The sheriff took pictures and wrote everything down in his notebook, but Harold could see the helplessness in his eyes. "I'll increase patrols," he had said, "but unless we catch them in the act." He left the sentence unfinished, both men knowing it wouldn't make much difference. As Harold polished the metal, trying to remove the crude wolf drawing, his mind wandered back to June 6, 1944. He had been just 22 years old then, stepping out of a C-47 aircraft into the dark skies over Normandy. The polishing cloth moved in circles as he remembered the weight of his parachute, the sound of anti-aircraft fire, and the courage it took to jump into that black night. He looked up at the photographs on his garage walls. There was one of his old unit, the men standing proud in their uniforms. Harold remembered each face, each name. Tommy from Georgia, who could fix any engine. Mike from Boston, who always shared his chocolate bars. Pete from Kansas, who never made it home. They had all been scared that night, but they had something stronger than fear. They had each other. The memory of another photograph made him stand up slowly, using his cane for support. In the back of the garage, in an old wooden box, he kept his most precious memories. Harold opened it carefully and took out a worn photograph he hadn't looked at in years. It showed him and his best friend Jack standing next to their military motorcycles in France. Jack had been their unit's best motorcycle messenger, fearlessly riding through dangerous territory to deliver crucial information. "Fear is just excitement without the right attitude," Jack used to say. Harold smiled at the memory, remembering how Jack had taught him to ride during the war. The smile faded as he remembered the last time he saw Jack, heading out on a message run near Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. Jack never returned, but his lessons about courage and standing up for what's right had stayed with Harold all these years. As the night grew deeper, Harold's garage became more than just a space for tools and memories. It became a bridge between past and present, between the young soldier he had been and the old man he had become. The scratches on his motorcycle weren't just vandalism anymore. They were a challenge to everything he and his friends had fought for. He thought about the steel wolves, with their loud bikes and aggressive behavior. They were bullies, yes, but Harold had faced worse. He remembered what his old commanding officer used to say: "The biggest mistake you can make with a bully is to give them the fear they're looking for." Around midnight, Harold made himself a cup of coffee and sat in his favorite chair in the garage. Above him, his old uniform hung neatly pressed in a glass case. The medals caught the light: Bronze Star, Purple Heart, reminders of times when courage meant the difference between life and death. His hands were shaking slightly, but not from fear. For the first time in weeks, he felt a familiar energy running through his body. It was the same feeling he had before every important mission during the war, a mix of anticipation and determination. Harold looked at his motorcycle again. Under the scratches and crude drawings, it was still the same machine that had carried messages across France. It was still strong, still reliable, just like him. Age hadn't changed what was inside, not for the bike and not for its rider. He reached for his phone and called Jenny at the diner. When she answered, worried about him calling so late, Harold's voice was stronger than it had been in years. "Jenny, I need you to tell me something," he said. "Where do these steel wolves spend their time when they're not causing trouble on my road?" "They hang out at the Thunder Road Bar and Grill," Jenny replied hesitantly. "But Harold, you're not thinking of—" "Thank you, Jenny," Harold said quietly. "And one more thing. I'll be needing my usual breakfast tomorrow morning. Early, I have something important to do." As he hung up the phone, Harold looked at the picture of Jack one more time before carefully placing it back in the box. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, Sergeant Harold Thompson would remind everyone, including himself, that courage doesn't have an expiration date. He stayed in his garage late into the night, working on his motorcycle, preparing for what was to come. The scratches wouldn't all come out, but that was okay. Like the scars from his war days, they would be reminders of battles fought and challenges faced. Tomorrow, they would be reminders of something else too, that it's never too late to make a stand. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Harold was up before the sun, putting on his old leather jacket with careful, deliberate movements. He had polished his combat boots the night before, not the new ones his grandson had given him, but the worn pair he kept from his service days. They were still sturdy, like the man who wore them. After his early breakfast at Jenny's diner, where he ate quietly despite the worried looks from the staff, Harold rode his motorcycle home and began his preparations. He took his time cleaning and checking every part of his bike, just as he had done thousands of times during the war. The scratches from the vandalism were still visible, but now they looked more like battle scars, marks of honor rather than shame. At exactly 2:00 p.m., when he knew the steel wolves would be gathering at the Thunder Road Bar and Grill for their daily meetings, Harold Thompson made his move. He started his motorcycle, its engine purring to life with a sound that was different from the harsh roar of the Steel Wolves' bikes. This was the sound of history, of reliability, of countless missions completed. As he rode through town, people stopped and stared. They had grown used to seeing Harold on his careful rides to the diner or the grocery store, but today was different. He sat straighter in the saddle, his white hair visible under his vintage leather cap, his cane secured carefully to the side of his bike. Some people tried to wave him down, worried about what he might be planning, but Harold kept going. The Thunder Road Bar and Grill came into view around the bend. In the parking lot, a row of gleaming motorcycles stood like black metal soldiers, the Steel Wolves' bikes. Their owners were inside, probably laughing and planning their next round of harassment. Harold could see Razor's distinctive motorcycle at the center, its chrome wolf's head ornament catching the afternoon sun. Without hesitation, Harold guided his military motorcycle right into the middle of their parking spots. The sound of his vintage engine caught the attention of everyone inside the bar. Through the windows, faces turned to watch as the 93-year-old veteran parked his bike directly in front of the entrance, taking up the space usually reserved for Razor himself. Harold took his time getting off his motorcycle. He grabbed his cane and stood up straight, just as he had done when standing for inspection all those years ago. His joints protested, but he ignored them. Some things were more important than comfort. The door of the bar swung open, and the Steel Wolves began to emerge, their faces showing a mix of surprise and anger. Razor came out last, his scarred face turning red when he saw who had dared to park in his spot. "Well, look who decided to come visit," Razor called out, his voice carrying across the parking lot. The old-timer himself. The other bikers laughed, but their laughter seemed uncertain. Something about Harold's calm presence made them uneasy. Instead of backing down, Harold did something that surprised everyone. He smiled. It wasn't a nervous smile or an angry one. It was the kind of smile a teacher might give to students who had much to learn. With measured steps, he walked toward the entrance of the bar, his cane tapping steadily on the asphalt. The Steel Wolves parted unconsciously, creating a path for him. Perhaps it was the way he carried himself, or maybe it was the sight of his combat boots, still shined to perfection after all these years. Whatever the reason, not one of them made a move to stop him. As Harold reached the door, he paused and looked at each of them in turn. His eyes were clear and steady, showing neither fear nor anger. These weren't the eyes of a frightened old man. They were the eyes of someone who had seen real conflict and lived to tell about it. "Gentlemen," Harold said, his voice carrying the same authority it had when he led men in combat, "I believe we need to have a conversation about respect, about honor, and about what it truly means to be strong." Without waiting for a response, he pushed open the door and walked inside. The Steel Wolves looked at each other, unsure what to do. Their usual tactics of intimidation seemed useless against this old veteran who had just walked into their territory as calmly as if he were entering his own home. After a moment's hesitation, they followed him inside, drawn by a curiosity they couldn't explain. The regular customers in the bar watched in amazement as Harold Thompson, the 93-year-old veteran they had all known for years, took a seat at the bikers' usual table and waited patiently for them to join him. What happened next would change everything, though not in the way anyone expected. The inside of Thunder Road Bar and Grill fell silent as Harold sat at the bikers' table. The afternoon sun filtered through dusty windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Regular customers watched nervously, some reaching for their phones, ready to call for help if needed. Razor and his Steel Wolves filed in after Harold, their boots heavy on the creaking floorboards. They formed a circle around the table, towering over the seated veteran. Razor pulled out a chair and sat directly across from Harold, his scarred face twisted in an amused smirk. "You've got guts, old man," Razor said, leaning back in his chair. "Coming into our place like this, either that or you've finally lost your mind." Harold placed his cane carefully on the table and looked around at the faces surrounding him. Young faces, angry faces, confused faces. He recognized something in their eyes, something he had seen before, long ago. "Let me tell you about courage," Harold began, his voice quiet but clear. "Real courage." He reached into his leather jacket and pulled out an old, worn photograph. He placed it on the table, smoothing it carefully with his weathered hands. The photograph showed a group of young soldiers standing next to their motorcycles in a muddy field. Their uniforms were dirty, but their faces showed pride and determination. Harold pointed to one of the young men in the picture. "That's Jimmy Martinez," he said, 19 years old. Rode his motorcycle through enemy fire to deliver crucial messages. Saved an entire company of men." He paused, touching the image gently. "Died 2 days later, giving his motorcycle's fuel to a stranded medical truck." The steel wolves shifted uncomfortably. Razor's smirk faded slightly as Harold pointed to another soldier in the photo. "Thomas O'Brien, we called him Irish, used to race motorcycles before the war. Could ride through anything. Gave his life protecting a French village from being cut off." Harold's voice remained steady, but his eyes grew distant with memories. One by one, Harold told their stories. Stories of brotherhood, sacrifice, and real courage. He spoke of nights spent repairing motorcycles under enemy fire, of riders braving impossible odds to deliver vital information, of men who gave their lives so others could live free. "We didn't ride to frighten people," Harold continued, looking directly at Razor. "We didn't ride to make ourselves feel powerful. We rode because others needed us, because it was the right thing to do." A younger member of the Steel Wolves, barely in his 20s, stepped closer to look at the photograph. "My grandfather was in the war," he said quietly. "He never talked about it." "Many didn't," Harold replied. "Some memories are too heavy to carry alone. That's why we had each other. Real brotherhood isn't about intimidation. It's about lifting each other up, protecting those who need protection." Razor stood up suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. For a moment, tension filled the room. Then he reached into his own jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. With hands that trembled slightly, he smoothed it out on the table. It was another old photograph, yellow with age. In it, a young soldier stood next to a military motorcycle, smiling at the camera. "My grandfather," Razor said, his voice rough with emotion. "Never met him. All I know is he died in the war. Mom said he was a motorcycle messenger." Harold leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. His eyes widened with recognition. "David Peterson," he said softly. "He served in my unit. Bravest man I ever knew." The silence in the bar grew deeper as Razor stared at Harold, his tough exterior cracking. You knew him?" "Knew him? Son, your grandfather saved my life at Bastogne. Rode through a blizzard to get medical supplies to our position." Harold's voice grew warm with memory. "He loved motorcycles more than anyone I ever met. Said they gave him freedom, purpose." Tears formed in Razor's eyes, something none of his gang had ever seen before. The scar on his face seemed less menacing now, more like a mark of pain than anger. "All these years," Razor said, "I've been trying to build something tough, something strong, but I never knew what real strength looked like until today." The regular customers in the bar watched in amazement as the feared leader of the Steel Wolves pulled up a chair next to Harold, eager to hear more about the grandfather he had never known. One by one, the other bikers gathered closer, their hostile attitudes melting away as Harold's stories painted pictures of real courage, real brotherhood, and real strength. In that moment, something profound changed in the Thunder Road Bar and Grill. The confrontation had become a connection, bridging generations and healing old wounds. Harold's stand hadn't required fists or threats, just the quiet power of truth and the strength of memories that needed to be shared. As the afternoon sun began to set, casting orange light through the windows of Thunder Road Bar and Grill, Harold and Razor sat surrounded by old photographs spread across the table. The other Steel Wolves gathered around them, their earlier hostility replaced by genuine interest. The regular customers, seeing that something remarkable was happening, had stopped watching nervously and started listening too. "Your grandfather carried this special toolkit," Harold explained, drawing a similar kit from his jacket. "He said a good rider always needs to be ready to help others." He opened the worn leather pouch, showing the carefully maintained tools inside. "This is the same kind he used. Never went on a ride without it." Razor picked up the toolkit with trembling hands. "I have one just like this at home," he said quietly. "Found it in Mom's attic. Never knew what it was for." His fingers traced the worn edges of the leather, touching a connection to his past he never knew existed. Harold nodded, understanding in his eyes. "David, your grandfather, he taught all of us how to properly maintain our bikes. Said a well-maintained motorcycle was like a faithful friend. Would never let you down when you needed it most." One of the younger Steel Wolves raised his hand hesitantly, like a student in class. Sir, what else was he like? Razor's grandfather? Harold's eyes lit up with memories. David had this laugh that could lift everyone's spirits, even in the darkest times. During the Battle of the Bulge, when we were surrounded and running low on supplies, he would tell jokes while fixing our bikes in the freezing cold. Razor wiped his eyes quickly, trying to hide his emotions from his gang. But the other bikers weren't paying attention to their leader's tears. They were all focused on Harold's stories, drawn into a world where motorcycles meant more than just making noise and causing trouble. The last time I saw him, Harold continued, his voice growing softer, he was heading out on a mission to get medical supplies. The weather was terrible. Snow so thick you could barely see your hand in front of your face. But there were wounded men who needed help. The bar had grown so quiet you could hear the ice settling in drinks. Even the bartender had stopped wiping glasses to listen. Before he left, he told me something I never forgot. Harold said, looking directly at Razor. He said, "A motorcycle gives you freedom. What matters is how you use that freedom. You can use it to run away from things, or you can use it to help others." Razor stood up suddenly, walking to the window. He stared out at the parking lot where Harold's military motorcycle sat among the Steel Wolves' bikes. After a moment, he turned back. "All this time," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I've been using my bike to scare people, to feel powerful. But my grandfather, he used his to save lives." One of the older members of the Steel Wolves spoke up. "Maybe we've been doing this all wrong, boss. Maybe there's a better way to be strong." Harold reached into his pocket and pulled out one more photograph. This one showed David Peterson receiving a medal for bravery. "Your grandfather earned this for saving 37 men in that snowstorm," he explained, handing the photo to Razor. "He never made it back from that mission, but those 37 men lived because of him. They had children, grandchildren. His courage created a legacy that lives on today." Razor studied the photo for a long time. The other Steel Wolves watched as their tough leader's face softened, years of anger and confusion giving way to something new, pride, understanding, and a hint of shame for how far they had strayed from what motorcycles were meant to be. "Mr. Thompson," Razor said finally, turning to Harold. We've been so wrong. About everything." He looked around at his gang members, who nodded in agreement. Would you tell us more about him? About all of them?" Harold smiled gently. "Of course. But first, I think we should move these bikes out of the fire lane. Their grandfather was always very particular about parking properly." For the first time, genuine laughter filled the Thunder Road Bar and Grill, not the mocking kind the Steel Wolves were known for, but warm, real laughter that brought people together instead of pushing them apart. As they walked out to move their motorcycles, Razor paused beside Harold's military bike. He touched the scratched paint and vandalized star with gentle fingers, the shame of what they had done hitting him hard. "We'll fix this," he promised quietly. "We'll make it better than new. It's what he would have wanted." Harold patted Razor's shoulder, seeing in him not the tough biker who had caused so much trouble, but the grandson of his old friend, a young man finally finding his way back to a legacy of honor he never knew he had. The change in the Steel Wolves didn't happen overnight, but it started the very next morning. As the sun rose over Montana, the roar of motorcycles could once again be heard on Route 12. This time, though, they weren't coming to cause trouble. Instead, a line of bikes pulled up in front of Harold's house, led by Razor carrying a box of tools and several cans of paint. "We're here to fix what we damaged," Razor announced as Harold came out onto his porch. The old veteran watched as 15 tough bikers began carefully straightening his bent mailbox and cleaning up the tire marks from his lawn. Some brought flowers to replant in the gardens they had trampled. Word spread quickly through the small town. People drove by slowly, amazed to see the Steel Wolves working respectfully under Harold's guidance. Jenny from the diner brought over coffee and donuts, no longer afraid to visit. She found Harold sitting in a lawn chair, teaching 3 young bikers the proper way to polish chrome without damaging it. In Harold's garage, Razor worked tirelessly to restore the military motorcycle they had vandalized. He had called in a favor from a friend who specialized in vintage vehicle restoration. Together, they carefully removed the scratches and repainted the Army star, making it shine even brighter than before. "My grandfather would have known exactly how to do this," Razor said one afternoon, carefully applying paint to the fuel tank. I wish I had asked my mom more about him when I was younger. Harold smiled and handed him a worn manual. This was your grandfather's repair guide. He wrote notes in the margins. I think he wants you to have it. As the days passed, the Steel Wolves began to change in other ways too. They still wore their leather vests with the wolf emblem, but now they added a small American flag patch in honor of veterans. Their bikes remained powerful and loud, but they no longer used them to frighten people. Instead, they became known for escorting elderly veterans to doctor appointments and helping stranded motorists on the highway. The Thunder Road Bar and Grill transformed as well. The walls, once bare except for neon beer signs, now displayed photographs of military motorcycle units from World War II. Harold's stories had inspired the owner to create a wall of honor celebrating local veterans. The Steel Wolves made sure every frame was polished and hung perfectly straight. One Saturday morning, Razor gathered his gang in Harold's driveway. They had been working on a surprise for weeks. Rolling up on a trailer was a perfectly restored 1942 Harley-Davidson WLA, exactly like the one Harold's friend Jack had ridden during the war. We found it in pieces at a salvage yard, Razor explained, his voice thick with emotion. Thought maybe you could help us restore it, make it a tribute to Jack and all the other riders who never made it home. Harold ran his hand along the rusty frame of the old motorcycle, memories flooding back. Jack would like that, he said softly. He always said a motorcycle was never truly broken, just waiting for someone to care enough to fix it. The project became a labor of love. Every evening, Harold's garage filled with bikers learning about history as they worked on the restoration. He taught them about the special features of military motorcycles, the codes they used during missions, and the brotherhood that existed between riders during the war. The Steel Wolves began organizing weekly rides to the local VA hospital, bringing books and companionship to elderly veterans. They learned that real strength wasn't about intimidation. It was about using their power to help others, just as Harold and his fellow soldiers had done so many years ago. Even their name took on a new meaning. Steel came to represent their determination to protect and serve their community, while Wolves reflected their pack mentality of looking out for one another and those in need. The snarl in their logo was replaced with a more noble expression, watching over their town with pride instead of menace. The most remarkable change was in Razor himself. The scar on his face, once a symbol of his tough image, became barely noticeable behind his genuine smile. He spent hours with Harold, learning not just about motorcycles and his grandfather, but about what it meant to be a true leader. You know what's funny? Razor said one evening as they finished working on Jack's bike. We thought we were so tough before, but we were just lost. Real toughness isn't about making others feel small, it's about having the courage to help them stand tall. Harold nodded, seeing in Razor the same spirit of service and brotherhood that he had seen in David Peterson so many years ago. The transformation was complete, not just of a motorcycle gang, but of hearts and minds finding their way back to what truly matters. 1 year had passed since Harold Thompson's brave stand at the Thunder Road Bar and Grill. The Montana morning was bright and clear as dozens of motorcycles lined up in front of his house. The occasion was special. It was the first annual Veterans Honor Ride, organized by the transformed Steel Wolves Motorcycle Club. Harold sat in his favorite porch chair, watching with pride as Razor directed the arriving bikes into neat rows. The Steel Wolves weren't alone today. Motorcycle clubs from 3 states had come to participate in the charity ride that would raise money for veterans' medical care and housing. Looking good out there, Harold called to Razor, who was wearing a new leather vest. The back still showed the Steel Wolves logo, but now it was surrounded by the words, Guardians of Legacy, established 1944 in honor of the World War II motorcycle messengers. Every Sunday morning had become a tradition at Harold's house. The Steel Wolves would gather in his driveway, bringing coffee and donuts. Young riders would sit on his porch steps, listening to stories about motorcycle mechanics and war history. More importantly, they learned about honor, respect, and using their passion for riding to help others. The restored military motorcycles, both Harold's original and the tribute bike for Jack, held places of honor in his garage. But they weren't just display pieces. The Steel Wolves had learned to ride them properly, and on special occasions, they would escort Harold on rides through town, proud to be seen with the man who had changed their lives. Jenny's Diner had become the unofficial clubhouse for their community service planning. The same tables where the Steel Wolves once intimidated customers now hosted meetings to organize food drives and motorcycle safety courses for young riders. The coffee was always free for any veteran who stopped by. Mr. Thompson, a young biker, called out, running up to the porch with excitement. "We just got word from the Children's Hospital. They approved our motorcycle therapy program." This was a new project the Steel Wolves had developed, where they would bring their bikes to visit sick children, teaching them about motorcycles and letting them sit on the carefully parked bikes. Harold smiled, remembering how just a year ago, parents would hurry their children away when they heard motorcycles coming. Now, kids waved excitedly whenever they heard the familiar rumble of the Steel Wolves riding through town. Razor walked up to join them on the porch, carrying a leather-bound album. "Found some more photographs of my grandfather," he said, sitting next to Harold. "Mom had them stored away all these years. Look at this one. He's working on a motorcycle in France, just like you described." The two men looked through the album together, their friendship a testament to how much things had changed. Razor had become like a grandson to Harold, visiting him almost daily and learning not just about motorcycles, but about life, leadership, and leaving a positive mark on the world. As the morning went on, more people from town joined the gathering. The mayor presented Harold with a key to the city for his role in transforming the community. Local business owners, who once feared the Steel Wolves, now sponsored their charity rides and community projects. The police chief, who used to get daily complaints about the motorcycle gang, now worked with them to organize motorcycle safety workshops for new riders. "You've done more for this town's safety than a dozen police officers could," he told Harold with a handshake. Before the charity ride began, Razor called everyone to attention. The Steel Wolves formed a circle around Harold's porch, their leather vests gleaming in the sun. Each vest now carried patches showing their community service achievements and veteran support activities. "1 year ago," Razor announced, his voice carrying across the crowd, "a brave man taught us what real courage looks like. He showed us that strength isn't about fear, it's about lifting others up." He turned to Harold. "You didn't just change our club, sir. You gave us a purpose, a legacy to live up to." Harold stood slowly, leaning on his cane, and looked at the gathered crowd. Where once he had seen troubled young men trying to prove their toughness, he now saw guardians of values worth preserving. The Steel Wolves had become protectors of their community, mentors to young riders, and supporters of veterans in need. "The legacy isn't mine," Harold said, his voice strong and clear. "It belongs to every rider who chooses to use their freedom to help others. That's what my generation fought for, and that's what you're all keeping alive today." As the motorcycles roared to life for the charity ride, Harold knew that his stand had created something lasting. The Steel Wolves would carry forward the values of courage, service, and brotherhood that he and his fellow soldiers had demonstrated so many years ago. The spirit of the motorcycle messengers lived on, not in memories of war, but in acts of peace and service to others.